On behalf of the USC Solway School of Public Policy, I want to welcome you to what I think will be a very engaging event. I wanted to just give a little background on how this came about. Some of you may know Jane Harmon. Jane is a member of the USC Board of Trustees. She's also a former member of Congress, serving for 17 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, and now she is the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C. Well, it was just about 3 weeks ago or so that she called me and said that Martin Frost and Tom Davis had just written a new book. It dealt with the ongoing conflict in Congress and the effect on that on good public policy making. And the book, as you know, has been getting a lot of positive press, but also a lot of commentary from political leaders of both the left and the right. And she suggested that it might be nice to invite Martin and Tom to USC to talk about it. So that's how this came about. Together, they have a combined congressional experience of over 40 years. They've worked together effectively over this period of time. One is a Democrat, one is a Republican, so they were able to bridge these partisan politics. Tom Davis served in Congress from 1994 to 2008, representing Virginia's 11th district. And during that time, he also served as the GOP campaign chairman for 2 cycles and as chairman of the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight. He retired undefeated in 2008.
And unindicted.
And unindicted. I'm from Illinois.
You know what I'm saying.
So that's an accomplishment. Tom is a graduate of Amherst College and the University of Virginia Law School, and he currently serves as director of Deloitte LLP and resides in Vienna, Virginia. Martin Frost served 26 years in Congress representing Dallas-Fort Worth area. During that time, he served 4 years as chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and 4 years as chair of the House Democratic Caucus. And got to know Saul Price a little bit. He also has undergraduate degrees in journalism and history from the University of Missouri and a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center. Martin is also a senior partner in the Washington office of the Polsinelli Law Firm and resides in Alexandria, Virginia. And your wife is here as well.
She's right there.
Yeah, glad to have you join us as well. Thank you for coming. We're excited to have these 2 veterans, political leaders with us to share their lessons on how better to govern. According to studies in political science, partisan polarization in Congress is the greatest it's been since the early 20th century. Political scientists have actually developed a measure of partisan polarization from about 1880 to today, and the data show that it's been about 100 years since we've had this kind of level of partisan divide in the United States. In addition, as you also know, in addition to extreme polarization, the 2 parties are of roughly equal strength. So what we have today is the interplay of extreme partisan polarization, of party parity, as well as divided government operating in a separation of power system. So it's a very challenging kind of context. Political economists have also developed a measure called the gridlock interval that seeks to measure the challenge of reaching agreement on legislation. And when the interval is large, significant policy making becomes more difficult. And from about 1945 to mid-1980s, the interval on a scale of 1 was between 0.3 and 0.42. Today it is 0.8. So that gives you a numerical sense of the gridlock facing the country. And as you know, the courts are also polarized. One final thing I wanted to mention is good governance is very important to what we do as a school. And we have 2 centers in particular that focus on governance. One is the Bedrosian Center, which works to promote effective governance and to shape public dialogue between the public and private sectors, as well as to support innovative scholarship on governance. The other is the Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy, which is very much focused on advancing post-partisanship and bipartisan policymaking, and seeks to influence policy decisions in some of the most important issues facing us. So I look forward to the insights that Martin and Tom will bring to this issue, and possibly new ways our political system can function and get back on track. So please join me in welcoming Martin Frost and Tom Davis.
So I'll start. I'm Tom Davis, represented Fairfax County. I was county executive there before I was in Congress. I knocked off Democratic incumbents every step along the way. And you know, after we term our chairman out on the Republican side after 3 terms. I was termed out as a committee chairman and just decided to go do something else with my life, where I'm now with Deloitte, but I'm also chairman of the Board of Trustees, Board of Visitors, we call it, at George Mason University, where I've taught political science when I've left. And we say today the parties are ideologically sorted, and we can spend a lengthy time going into detail on anything we say, but I just want to go through quickly what has happened. Of course, this is the 2012 election. You got the left coast here in blue. You've got middle America. A lot of this. Republicans own rural America, except for 3 sections: college towns, majority minority counties. You can see the black belt through here. These are majority African American counties, and then Indian majority counties. But by and large, rural America is owned by Republicans, and cities are owned by Democrats. And we can talk at length about why that is. But people, it's race, ethnicity, culture, economics is like a poor fourth in terms of how people pick their political parties. I always say the wealthiest precincts in this country, here from Beverly Hills to Bethesda, to Potomac, Maryland, McLean, Virginia, Pound Ridge, New York, heavily Obama. And you take the poor counties through Appalachia. We have charts in the book that heavily for Romney.
Heavily for. Not for Obama, but for his opponent.
Yeah.
The rural areas,
yeah. So the ideological sorting of the parties, that's what has happened today. This wasn't true. You used to have liberal Republicans. You had Tom Kuechel here in California, was kind of the epitome of the liberal Republican. He was the whip for the Republicans back in the 60s during the Civil Rights era. You had conservative Democrats, no more. Ideological sorting of parties, and Martin and I were thrown together. We did some TV together where they like to have a Republican and a Democrat talking. We started talking afterwards and said, how things get, and so we started to identify some of these things and decided finally to write a book together. But let me just go quickly about 3 macro trends that have emerged over the last 20 years. They didn't exist 20 years ago. They were just starting to come together, starting to formulate when we were campaign chairman. One of my keys to being successful as campaign chairman is we kind of saw these in operation and were able to target districts as they were moving. But let me start. Redistricting today, far different than even 20 years ago. 80% of the districts in the House, about 60% of the Senate, basically the only race that matters is the primary election. The general election is nothing more than a constitutional formality that they have to go through to get elected. So members orient their time, their effort, their rhetoric, and their voting to their primary electorate who elects them. Compromise is generally not rewarded by primary voters, who are a pretty thin ideological slice of the electorate. And in states like mine, Virginia, it's a convention state where it gets even more polarized, right and left. It's the redistricting. 3 factors have caused this. Obviously, the new software was pioneered in California that charts these congressional districts, but it's gerrymandering. It's residential sorting patterns where people who think alike live alike. So you have vast enclaves where you couldn't draw a district of the other parties if you tried. There just aren't enough of them. That's cities and rural areas we talked about. And then the Voting Rights Act, which basically says you can't discriminate against minorities when drawing lines. So you end up packing minorities, and when you're packing minorities, who are you packing? Packing Democrats, and you end up bleaching the districts around it. So the end result today in the Deep South, all you have are white conservative Republicans and black liberal Democrats, and no need to talk to the other side because they are not relevant in the other party's primary. Probably not good in terms of bringing together the country, but it is, I would say, an unintended consequence of the Voting Rights Act is it is one of the causes of the polarization. Now, 2 other factors. And Martin and I have a different bent on that. He takes the Democratic line on that, but I'll let him explain it. On the media, business models have changed markedly over the last 20 years with the growth of the internet, talk radio, television. You watch Fox and MSNBC. We always say this isn't serious news. These are business models. They are successful business models. People come in and they get fed every night with what they want to hear. The problem with this, though, is there are different sets of facts. Members come on the floor and their constituents are dealing with different sets of facts. Martin and I were on the floor for the speaker's vote this year, and I'm sitting in the back, and I'm sitting with some members behind me, and one of the members said, he said, I got 1,000 calls this morning telling me to dump John Boehner and vote for Louis Gohmert. He said, obviously these people had never met Louis Gohmert, or they couldn't be, he ended up getting 2 votes. But this was all generated by a couple of radio commentators, and their flock was out there just bombarding these members, and ended up 25 members didn't vote for Boehner for Speaker on the Republican side. So cable news, talk radio, and then the internet, where there is absolutely no filters. What we say, the crap to content ratio coming over the internet is just so high, and people get fed this. You can walk in the Republican cloakroom for news, and on the computers in there, it's right on the Drudge Report. You go over to the Democrat, it's right on Huffington Post. Again, just these are different worlds. These are this bizarre world, how these two don't even speak the same language as they move together. That is another cause for polarization. How members are and their constituents are receiving their information and acting. And then finally, the money in politics has moved from the center, from political parties, which have been a centering force for 200 years in American politics. It's moved out to the wings. This is a result of McCain-Feingold. This was the bill that basically eliminated soft money for the parties. Martin and I both opposed this bill. We thought it was a terrible thing because we said, you think this money's going to disappear because you can't give it to the parties where it's transparent, where it's all recorded and we know where it's coming? Now it's out there in dark money and 501c4s and everything else. Put, by the way, on steroids through the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United. Very foreseeable. Martin can talk to you about some conversations he had at the time. Where you could see the courts moving in this direction or possibly moving. But the end result is now the parties in these key races, parties spend less money than the interest groups. And the parties are at least recorded. Parties and candidates combined in Jolly's, when Bill Young died in Florida, spent less than these third-party groups in this. But these third-party groups are ideological in their nature, and they play in primaries. And nobody is there to protect members who center themselves in a primary. So an interest group can drop $1 million or $2 million on a candidate like that, and he's got to raise it. He or she has to raise their money in small increments. It's really an unfair fight. But I'll tell you what, members adjust their behavior accordingly. If that's the rule, I'm going to make sure I'm not ticking these groups off. So few Republicans voted for aid to Hurricane Sandy because Club for Growth, Freedom Works, Heritage Action scored the vote. And why take a chance? It's going to pass. They're not going to pass with my vote. I'm not going to get on this list and have these guys come in and spend $1 million on me. And so that is kind of that, behavior is patterned after that. Next slide. So I like some of these congressional districts. I just love this because this is, believe it or not, is a congressional district. This is the 12th district. It's a voting rights district in North Carolina. Next slide. Maryland's 3rd district. That is a congressional district. I think if Picasso were alive, he would see him enshrined in politics. This is the earmuff district. There's a Hispanic district in Chicago, Luis Gutierrez's district. This is Maryland's 2nd district, a Democratic gerrymander. This is Philadelphia. This is the 7th district of Pennsylvania. This is a Republican gerrymander in the Philadelphia suburbs. Looks like one dog kicking another, if you go back to it. One dog kicking the other right there in the face. Next slide. Voting now is we have a chapter in our book called All Politics is No Longer Local. In legislative races. Now, this is not governor's races, it's not mayor's races, but in legislative races now, what we see are people voting the party, not the candidate. Candidates matter and campaigns matter, but not this much. And so the end result is people are voting straight parliamentary. And to just prove it, look, this last election, these were all Democratic seats above in seats where Romney was 15% or greater, as you can see, the Republicans swept those 4 seats. Where Romney was 5 points or better, Republicans swept them. Remember, the electorate was tilted a little bit more Republican than the presidential race, so you expect that. In races where it was within 5 points, the Republicans took North Carolina. Warner in Virginia, everybody's shocked on election night, it's so close, but when you look at the macro, it should have been close. He could have lost. Point is, he'd been a governor and he was pretty well entrenched, and he still almost lost because the parliamentary straight ticket voting habit almost took him down. And then the next 2 states after Warner were Colorado and Iowa. Basically, what the argument here is that people are voting the party. So people are behaving in a parliamentary manner, voting for the parties. The problem is this isn't a parliamentary system, it's a balance of power system. It doesn't work very well. And members, when they come to Congress, are acting like it's a parliamentary system. The party of the president in Congress is not this is not the third branch of government or the second branch of government. We're an appendage to the president. We're going to make him look good because our destinies are intertwined and they work together. And the minority party now is no longer the minority party, they're the opposition party. So instead of being a minority shareholder in government, mitigating bad effects, offering them, they're just no on everything. Everything's filibuster. Everything is no. Now, this is National Journal puts a chart together, shows the most liberal Republican, the most conservative Democrat, and with a very broad definition of moderates, describes how many members are between that. 1982, between the most liberal Republican, which I think was Bill Green of New York at that time, most conservative Democrat, there are 344 members in their voting behavior in Washington in floor votes, 344 broadly defined moderate members. By 1994, it had dropped to 252. By 2002, it had dropped to 137. And by 2014, 3. Matheson retired in Utah. Okay, McIntyre retired in North Carolina. And Barrow in Georgia, the third Democrat, was defeated in a Republican sweep. So that's where we are. Next slide. Senate, 58 members in 1982 were in that broad moderate. By 1994, 34, 2002, 7, and the last 3 Congresses, 0. That is what these macro factors have produced in terms of behavior and actual voting on the floor, and why very little is getting done. Compromise is punished by the primary voters, who basically make up the majority of the party caucuses, and not rewarded. This just talks about we call these blue wall states over here. 18 states plus the district have voted Democrat now for 6 straight times in presidential elections. That is a trend. Democrats start with 242 electoral votes. Republicans have a red wall of 13 states. It's 102 electoral votes. I'll go back just a minute. Is 102 electoral votes, but you see you only need 270 to win. So it's advantage that the House of Representatives right now is constructed so the Republicans have an advantage. Democrats got 1.4 million more votes for the House in 2012 than the Republicans, but the Republicans had a 17-seat margin. But in the Electoral College, the Democrats start off with a big lead. Republicans have to carry Ohio and Florida. They can still win, but it's a narrower path for them, all things being equal. Next slide is this just goes back to the last presidential election. Then what I took is the blue, to show the parliamentary voting habits. In these red wall states, the states that have voted Republican 6 straight times, the Senate lineup is 25-1. The one Democrat, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, is already talking about running for governor next time. She won by less than 1% in her last election. On the Democratic side of the 18 states, it's 32 Democrats and 4 Republicans, but 3 of those 4 Republicans were elected in 2010, which was the biggest Republican off year since 1938. And they are at risk. They come up next time. This is in Wisconsin, in Illinois, and Pennsylvania. The 4th, Susan Collins, is from Maine. Maine is a state with not a lot of turnover. It's a white state. It's a small state. Personal politics still matters. The other senator from Maine is an independent. Because of the political constituencies it made with the Quebecois, used to make up the Democratic Party, your French Canadians, but are very conservative socially. It has a different mix of flavor there, where independence still makes a difference, but it's one of a handful of states where that really matters. 2016 races, as you see, Republicans have 7 seats they have to defend in states Obama carried. So the Senate will be very much in contention. What it means for Mitch McConnell is he's got to manage the Senate in a way not to jeopardize those 7 members. He can't lurch too far to the right, even though he has a caucus that wants him to, because he's got to protect these 7 members, who, by the way, will leave him if he goes too far to the right, which puts him at odds with the House, which is going to pass the most conservative measures they can. The Homeland Security appropriations bill is up now. They basically, the leaders there have kind of different directions that they are being pulled, even though they are Republican. And we can talk about more in the Q&A, but that's kind of an intro. I call it the good news from Washington before I turn it over to Martin.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. I'm curious, before we start, how many people in this room were born in California? Me too. I was born in Glendale. My dad was worked for Lockheed in Burbank. They didn't have a hospital in Burbank, so I was born in Glendale. My parents met at the University of Texas. My dad was an engineer. First job out of the University of Texas School of Engineering was with Lockheed out in California. I don't talk about, when I was running for office in Texas, I didn't talk about being born in California. I talked about how I'd grown up in Texas and my family had been in Texas for generations, but you understand how that works. Now, let me comment about a couple things that Tom said, and then I want to talk about things that we have suggested in our book as potential solutions. We don't have all the answers, but we've got some of them. First of all, when Tom talks about a parliamentary system, under a parliamentary system, the majority party or the majority party coalition gets the prime minister. So you have a unitary government. We don't have a unitary government in the United States. You often have a president of one party and a Congress of the other party, at least one house of the Congress of the other party. So it makes no sense for our elected officials to behave like they were in a parliamentary system where everything is party, but that's what they do. And that's one of the problems that we have right now. Now, some of the solutions that we see for the future. One would be for Congress to pass legislation requiring every state to draw its congressional districts with a bipartisan commission. Now, California recently went to that system. Some of y'all may not like the system in California, but the states have been the laboratories of invention in our country for a long time. So some states have gone to a bipartisan system, not only California, Arizona, Iowa, the state of Washington, and New Jersey. But all the other states have their congressional districts drawn by their legislatures. And that's how you get those funny-looking districts that Tom put up on the board. Because the legislatures want to, if the Democrats control the legislature, they want to protect the Democratic congressmen and create as many Democratic districts as possible. If the Republicans control the legislature, they want to do exactly the opposite thing. And the result of that, as Tom mentioned, in 2012, the Democrats got more votes, 1.4 million votes cast for Congress, but the Republicans got a majority of the districts. So that the system, because of the way the districts were drawn, tilted the election in one direction. Now, that could change. The districts are redrawn every 10 years, and if the Democrats regain control of a number of state legislatures, they could do exactly the same thing that the Republicans did this last time. What happened was in 2010, when the elections of 2010, when the members of the state legislatures were being elected, the Republicans did a great job of organizing state by state, and they took control of a number of state legislatures, and now you have states where Obama carried the state, the popular vote, but because the Republicans control the legislature, the congressional delegation is 2-to-1 Republican, or even worse in some cases. Now, again,
Or better.
now, the point of all this is that nothing is static in American politics, and what the Republicans did to the Democrats could just as easily be done by the Democrats to the Republicans after the next round of redistricting. Now, the result of all this, of safe districts for one party or the other, is that, as Tom mentioned, there is no incentive for one side to talk to the other side. Because if you do that, if you're seen in public with a member of the other party or you work with the other party, then you're going to get an opponent in your own party's primary. So Republicans live in mortal fear of some person from the extreme right who's got a lot of money running against them in a low turnout Republican primary. Democrats have the same fear of someone from the far left who can raise a lot of money running against them in a low turnout primary. So, and there are a lot of reasons why primaries are low turnout in this country. One is that they're all on different dates, and people can't kind of figure out when the primary is going to occur. And some states do not permit independents. If you could register as an independent, you're not permitted to vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. So the system is rigged to have a relatively small group of people selecting the nominee who's then going to be elected in the general election in most cases, because it's either a Republican or a Democratic district. So there is no incentive at all for the two sides to talk to each other. Well, whether Congress will ever pass a legislation requiring states to go to bipartisan commissions, we don't know. But we've talked to constitutional scholars who have told us that under Article 1, Article 1 is the legislative branch of the Constitution, that Congress has the authority to pass legislation like this if it chooses to do so. And maybe there'll be such an uproar in the public that Congress will choose to do that at some time. We would hope so. There was a bipartisan policy commission that made a very detailed report on congressional changes that was released last summer. They recommended bipartisan commissions, but they said it should be up to each state. They didn't say that Congress should require this. So you leave it up to the states, and very few states will voluntarily do that. In California, you have initiative and referendum, so you could force the state to do that. A lot of states don't have that. We like to brag in Texas, we don't have any of that good government stuff. We don't have initiative and referendum. We don't have term limits. We don't have recall. You can't do any of that stuff in Texas. And we have no limits on what people can spend and can contribute to candidates. We're the Wild West. There's good news and there's bad news about that. So we're not going to voluntarily choose to go to a bipartisan commission. Texas is now the largest Republican delegation in the country. The state of Texas, and we have a Republican governor, and Republicans control both legislatures, so we're not going to voluntarily give up any of that power. There are a lot of Republican members from my state that I know. I served in Congress for 26 years as a Democrat. A lot of these are very fine, principled people, but they will not vote in the middle. They will not compromise because they live in, as I said, in mortal fear that some crazy from the far right is going to take them out in a primary. So there's a disincentive in our current system for us to reach the middle. Now, I want to go back, and some of you, this is before some of you were born, of course, but some of you were old enough to remember this. In the mid-1960s, and this is highlighted in the movie Selma, some of you may have seen that, when the Civil Rights Act of '64 was passed and the Voting Rights Act of '65 was passed, this was done on a bipartisan basis. Lyndon Johnson was president, and he romanced Everett McKinley Dirksen, who was the Republican leader in the Senate. And the reason he did that is that he needed to break a filibuster in the Senate to be able to get the bills up. And at that time, you had conservative Democrats from the South for historical reasons and who were anti-civil rights. You had liberal Democrats from the North who were pro-civil rights, but you didn't have enough Democrats to break a filibuster. So he needed Republican votes. And he went to Dirksen and he said, Ev, you're from the land of Lincoln. You're from Illinois. You've got to be for civil rights. And ultimately, Dirksen, the Republican leader, provided the votes to break the filibuster to make it possible to pass those two pieces of landmark civil rights legislation. Couldn't do that today. It would be impossible. Now, there is another aspect of all this that Tom's talked about, and I will elaborate on, and that's the role of money in politics. There's always been money in politics. That's not going to go anyplace anytime soon. However, Congress a number of years ago passed some reform legislation in the 1970s, and one of the things it did was to limit how much an individual could give to a congressional candidate. It created the Federal Election Commission. It created political action committees, limited how much those political action committees could give to candidates, and also attempted to place an aggregate limit on what a candidate could raise and spend for the House and the Senate. Well, the Supreme Court threw out the aggregate limits, preserved much of the rest of the law. Basically, the Supreme Court, it's very interesting, this was a time when you had a majority of Democrats on the court. This was not a Republican court. The Supreme Court took the position that money equals speech. It's a free speech issue. And so you can't limit the ability of people to contribute to political campaigns or to spend money. You could, as an anti-corruption matter, limit how much they could give to any one candidate. So that rolls along for a long time. The political parties, however, were permitted to raise unlimited amounts from unions, from corporations, from wealthy individuals. The committee that I chaired, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, could raise large amounts, but we had to disclose that. Fully disclosed. I, as chairman of the committee, had to file a report with the FEC on a regular basis, and if I got a large contribution from Saul Price, which I did from time to time, I had to disclose that. People knew who was giving the party money. Then along comes McCain-Feingold. This was legislation, and I used to be a reporter. I have a journalism undergraduate degree. I worked as a magazine reporter, a newspaper reporter, and a television reporter. So I am very much inclined to freedom of the press. However, on this issue, the editorial pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times drove this issue. We have to reform our campaign laws, and anybody who votes against reforming those laws is not a loyal American, so to speak. They didn't use those words, but that's what they were saying. So McCain-Feingold passed, and I spoke out against it, as did Tom. And one of the reasons we spoke out against it was that McCain-Feingold outlawed contributions, large contributions to political parties, publicly disclosed contributions to political parties. So no more. Unions couldn't write big checks. Corporations couldn't write big checks to political parties, and individuals couldn't write big checks to political parties. That money was used for voter turnout, to organize people, to get them to go vote. But the Congress, in its infinite wisdom, outlawed that money. And at the time, I had a dialogue with a leading reformer, and I said to that person, "Don't you understand that this is going to destroy or dramatically weaken the role of political parties in our country?" And he said, "Well, political parties need to be reined in." And then I said, "Well, you know, won't the result be that money is then going to go out to the extremes? It's going to go out to groups that are organized, they're outside the parties, that have particular agendas." And he said, "Well, we fixed that." And I said, "Oh?" He said, "Yes, we put a limit that these outside groups can't spend this money within 30 days of a primary or 60 days of a general election." And I said, "Well, what if the courts invalidate that?" And he said, "Well, our lawyers tell us it's okay." Well, it wasn't okay. That was invalidated by the court system. And so now you don't have those limits on that outside money being spent within 30 days or 60 days of an election. And as a result of Citizens United, a very well-known Supreme Court case, now corporations and labor unions have the right to contribute unlimited amounts of money to these organizations, and many of which don't disclose the contributions. So you now have this dark money going to the fringes where they can parachute into a particular state or a particular district at the last minute, drop a couple of $1 million in opposition to a candidate, and change the outcome. And as Tom mentioned, it's not just that they come into the districts, but they threaten to come in, or that members are worried that they may come in. So very few members are actually defeated in party primaries these days. It doesn't happen very often. But members change their voting patterns because they're worried that they might lose the next primary because of this outside money. And so they then, as I said, their record moves to the fringes. They don't talk to the other side. What we have proposed, in addition to having districts drawn on a bipartisan basis, is to have full disclosure, is to simply pass legislation saying that any organization that mentions a federal candidate by name in an ad has to fully disclose its contributors in a timely basis, just as the way the parties used to have to disclose their contributors pre-McCain-Feingold. Hadn't gone very far. Now, some people would say, "Oh, let's just have a constitutional amendment to reverse the result of Citizens United." You may get emails. I get emails from people all the time saying, "Sign this petition, give money to this group so we can have a constitutional amendment to reverse Citizens United." Well, the real world is that you can't pass a constitutional amendment in this country very easily. I often speak to high school students and middle school students, and I point out to them, we were a country established by revolutionaries who set up a very conservative form of government. It is damn hard to do anything in this country. A bill has to pass the House, it has to pass the Senate, it goes to a conference committee, it comes back out, it's voted on again, it goes to the President can veto it, and if you want to override the President's veto, it requires a 2/3 vote of each House. Also, if you want to amend the Constitution of the United States, it has to be adopted by 2/3 of each House and ratified by 3/4 of the states. And it's almost impossible to amend the Constitution. It happens occasionally in our history, has happened, but not very often. So amending the Constitution is not an option, as realistically, but you can require full disclosure. Some of the other things that we recommended, and we wrote an op-ed piece for the LA Times that appeared a week ago yesterday. In the LA Times, and it's been republished in some other papers. And this is somewhat controversial. We have suggested bringing back what are called earmarks on appropriation bills. That means a member of Congress or a senator can specify how money is spent for a particular project. That was outlawed a few years ago because there had been some abuses. there was a member of Congress from San Diego, Randy Duke Cunningham, who basically sold earmarks, took bribes to earmark the particular defense contracts. He went to a federal penitentiary, as he should have. So there was an overreaction, and then now you can't have any, you can't earmark, you can't specify how a particular how money will be spent on a particular appropriations bill on a particular project. For those, I don't know how many of you have spent any time in Washington, D.C. Washington, the Virginia and Maryland suburbs, but mostly the Virginia suburbs of Washington, are connected by bridges across the Potomac. There are 3 or 4 bridges, and if you want to commute, you think commuting is bad out here. If you want to commute from Virginia into the district, you got to go across one of those bridges. And some years ago, Tom got an earmark to provide for badly needed repair on the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, one of those bridges that connected his district in Virginia with the suburbs in Maryland and ultimately into D.C. That was an earmark. Years ago, the business community in Dallas, the city that I represented, came to me and said, Congressman, we think we're a great city. We're one of the 10 largest cities in the United States, and we want to have mass transit. To be a great city, in most cases, you need to have mass transit. So I then got an earmark to build a light rail system called DART, D-A-R-T. It was patterned after BART in Bay Area in San Francisco. And so I got an earmark for the DART system, and we now have a very good above-ground light rail system in Dallas. Would not have happened without earmarks. Earmarks only constitute about 1 or 2% of all the money spent in appropriation bills. They're a relatively small portion. They don't add anything to the total. It just means it's a direction on how some of the money that Congress has already agreed to be spent, already agreed to be appropriated, will be spent. So it's a zero-sum game. You're not adding anything to the total budget of the federal government, and you are giving members of Congress the right to exercise their authority under Article 1 of the Constitution. And it used to be, for years and years, members could earmark, and then we decided we would reform ourselves, and we did away with it. What we are suggesting is that you bring back earmarks, but in a limited way. One, and a lot of these were done in secret in the past, and you didn't know who put the money into the bill. We've suggested that the member has to put his name on the bill, on the earmark, and it has to be for his congressional district, his or her district, or his or her state. It can't be from some other part of the country. Makes sense, but hasn't happened. The reason that we propose this is a tool for the leadership of both parties to encourage members to vote for appropriation bills. You know, we have this situation where the government operates under a CR because the Congress can't come together and pass an appropriations bill. We have that with the Homeland Security appropriations measure right now. It's about to run out. If you had some earmarks, that would provide incentives for members to vote for a compromise package. It would give members some skin in the game, and it would also provide the leadership some additional tools for being able to deal with members and getting them to support consensus legislation. We've also suggested having a national primary day for Congress. Now, not for presidents. States could still have their presidential primaries whenever they wanted to, but that all the primaries for the U.S. House and for the Senate would be on the same day nationwide. And one of the reasons for that is it would focus more press attention on when the primaries were going to occur, and hopefully you'd have larger turnouts. And if I'm all for large turnouts. When I was a member of Congress, I would always live with whatever the result was. What I feared was a small turnout and a small, well-organized group being able to swing an election against me or one of my candidates when I was chairman of the committee. And we've recommended some other things. I will touch on one other thing and then we'll give you all a chance to ask some questions. Tom and I have a different view of the Voting Rights Act. I believe the Voting Rights Act was the right thing. There was almost all the southern states prior to the passage of Voting Rights Act did not have any, had a large African American population, didn't have any African American members because the legislatures had conspired to protect the white incumbents and had spread out the black community and not had districts where blacks could win, and Hispanics in certain other areas. So that was changed by the Voting Rights Act. It is not the inevitable result, however, that you had to have just white districts or just black districts. What the Republican Party did in a very clever way was they put together state by state, in some states, not in all, some coalitions of Republican legislators and activists in the black community, because some Democratic state legislatures had not drawn African American districts, and the Republicans said, oh, we've got a deal for you. Let's make these districts 65, 70, 75% African American, so African American can't lose, can't be defeated in a primary by a white. Now, that's not what the Voting Rights Act required. The Voting Rights Act required there to be an opportunity for a minority to be elected. Not that minorities be packed into a few districts, but that's what the Republicans did successfully in some states. So you have packed districts with a very large concentration of black members in the South, and the blacks who had lived nearby in the surrounding areas were packed into those districts, and as Tom mentioned, those surrounding districts were bleached. They don't have minorities in them in any great number, and so the minority community lost political power because they now don't have the power to influence the outcome in the surrounding districts, only to determine the outcome in the center city single districts. It was a very clever move on the Republicans' part. I think it was wrong, and I think it was in violation of the spirit of the Voting Rights Act, but the court in later years, which has changed in its makeup, approved those kind of districts. And so we have that situation in the South now. Not in the North, necessarily, but in the South. It's a very interesting time. The only other comment I would make is about the internet and the media. When I was elected to Congress in 1978, and that was a long time ago, there was no C-SPAN. The cameras were turned on in March of '79, so you couldn't turn on your TV and watch what was going on in the House. There were no all-news cable stations. CNN went on the air in June of 1980, in my first term. And there was no internet. The internet didn't really come online until about 1989, 88, somewhere in that period of time. So it was a different world. Now, as coming out of journalism, having a journalism degree, I am not for censorship. I don't want to change this, but I think we have to understand the system that we live under, the way things have changed, and we have to figure out how to deal with that. I would get emails from my right-wing cousins in Texas, and they would send me stuff about, oh, isn't this horrible, what the benefits that Congress gets. They'd say, oh, you get a lifetime pension after 2 years. Well, that's not true, of course. And I would have to then respond to them and say, what you read on the internet is not true, and this is why it's not true. So we have a very complicated system today. A lot has changed, but we should do some things to try and to get a system where people can meet in the middle and perhaps be able to compromise in the best interest of our country. When I was elected to Congress, a few years later, there was a congressman from Miami. His name was Bill Lehman. He had been a used car dealer before he was in Congress. And Bill used to say that he didn't think he could fall any lower in public esteem being a used car dealer, and then he was elected to Congress. Well, that was when Congress's ratings were like 25 or 30% approval. Now it's down to 7%. So something terrible has happened. It's not in the best interest of our country that Congress is held in such ill repute, and that it is ill regard, and that it is so hard for Congress to get anything done. So let me stop, and we'll be glad to take questions on anything you've heard or anything you'd also like to know about the future. Tom and I agree on a lot of this, even though he's a partisan Republican. I'm a partisan Democrat. There's no bones about that. But we do agree on that changes need to be made in our system. Okay.
I have a question for Congressman Davis. My name is Lou Phillips. I'm the representative of the group No Labels here at USC, and I understand that Deloitte is working with No Labels.
Bill's one of the, Tom is one of the organizers of No Labels.
Oh, no kidding.
I'm a co-founder, yeah.
Okay, good to know. Well, my question for you is, what sort of effect do you think groups like No Labels and Represent.us and other reformist and kind of centrist political groups, what sort of practical effect do you think that they're going to have on American politics in the coming decade, but especially as we move forward to the 2016 presidential election?
They're trying to create a constituency where people who compromise get rewarded for it. Because if you can't compromise in a balance of power system, the system falls down. That's not to think I don't have some strongly held views and I'd like to have it my way. But when you can't pass appropriation bills on time, when you're running the government on continuing resolutions or shutdowns, the whole thing shut down. So we've tried to create an atmosphere here where we bring some pretty partisan members together, and liberals and conservatives, but they talk to each other about, let's focus on the goals, and then if we focus on the goals, we may disagree how to get there, but at least it brings the conversation into focus. And we're optimistic about it. We're getting organized in New Hampshire and Iowa, trying to get presidential candidates to buy in. Our national leaders are Joe Lieberman on the Democratic side, John Huntsman on the Republican side. Dick Gephardt is taking part. He's a former Democratic leader. So we're hopeful, but you're up against these macro trends, which are very, very tough. We raised some money. We did have an effect in the Colorado Senate race this year with Cory Gardner. I had breakfast with Mark Udall, who's a good friend of mine, a Democratic member, and he was upset because No Labels we didn't endorse, but we said some nice things about Cory Gardner. So Mark, you can join too. You'd be a natural. He said, well, Harry Reid won't let me do it. And so we end up running some ads for Gardner. When they're trying to demonize him on the right, he's got a No Labels seal of approval, and he ends up winning the Senate race. Dean Heller used it too in Nevada. But it centers these guys when they come in. When you're looking for a deal, both of these guys on the Republican side are going to probably be in on the deal. And we think that's important because right now, Boehner can negotiate a deal with Obama, but by the time he's back on Capitol Hill, you've got Rush Limbaugh and you've got Sean Hannity denouncing it. Members' phones, the switchboards are lighting up like a Christmas tree, and they can't bring them along. We have good leaders, but you don't have enough followers, and that's kind of the problem we're in right now.
I was wondering about the McCain-Feingold reform and when that happened, and if you talked about dark money coming in from the sides and sort of it creating a fear for people going into their primaries. Is that fear for both Democrats and Republicans?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Right now, the schisms are more pronounced on the Republican side because they don't have a president. And if the schisms are more pronounced on the Republican side because they don't have a president. Remember, the president's party becomes an appendage of the White House. So when Bush was there, you didn't have the Tea Party, did you? The Tea Party came in with Obama, even though Bush was overspending and doing Medicare Part and bailouts and people that they denounced. And you ask now, where are all the anti-war groups with Obama? They've kind of bought in, and so there is a disciplining factor when you have a president that the schisms aren't quite as loud, but they're there, and they are still present in primaries. And we know a number of members, Joe Lieberman being one, who's vice president and get one year, and he's getting knocked out for his Senate reelect the next in a Democratic primary.
It can happen on both sides. My friend Blanche Lincoln, who was a member of the House before she was a member of the Senate, Democrat, from Arkansas, she faced a very serious challenge from the left in her primary for renomination in Arkansas. She won, but she was so weakened that she didn't have much left for the general election, and then she lost the general election. Now, Arkansas has been moving to the Republican side anyway. She might have lost anyway if she hadn't been bled dry during the primary by groups to her left, but it didn't help her any in terms of getting ready to take on a tough Republican opponent. So it can happen on the Democratic side, but it is more pronounced on the Republican side right now.
But we give examples about Tim Holden in Pennsylvania, who was a good, he's a labor Democrat, but he was for tort reform, and on some, because he had a more Republican district. Once they moved him into a Democratic district, Democrats said, "Thank you, Tim. We want a real Democrat." So that both sides have it.
Yeah, but that happens more often right now on the Republican
Because
side.
we don't have a president.
I think somebody over here.
Interesting historical fact. I happen to be the director of the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois. After that McCain-Feingold Act passed, and we had an award that we gave called Ethics in Government, named after Paul Douglas.
Oh, sure.
And so we gave this award to McCain-Feingold for this law. But it's we're always worried about it because when people are still alive and you don't know what's going to happen.
That's right.
You don't know what the unintended consequences of the law can be, which I think have turned out to be negative in many respects.
Yeah.
Well, just to add, Chris Shays was the House author of this. We mentioned his book. Right. It was Shays Meehan in the House, and Shays now regrets that he was ever on the bill the way it's turned out.
Yeah, the problem with any legislation like this, particularly dealing with money in politics, is money, like water, will find its level. And unless you go to totally federally financed elections, you're going to have big money spent in some way in elections in this country. And what you have to do is to maximize disclosure, maximize accountability. And you might ask, well, why don't we have federally financed elections? Well, the public is overwhelmingly opposed to their tax money being used to pay for the campaign of somebody running for Congress. You poll on this, and members of Congress know this, and you tried it on the federal, it's interesting, you tried it on the presidential level. We had matching funds available for candidates running for president in the primary, starting in 1976, and then you had federal financing in the general election, but the courts held that this had to be voluntary. You could not require people to follow these limits. Now,
So who broke it? Obama.
who broke it the first time was Bush.
Well, in a primary. In a primary, not in the general.
But that's what happened.
In the general election, though, Obama broke it. He had a 2-to-1 spending advantage. This great reformer.
And in 2000, George W. Bush figured out that he couldn't beat John McCain unless he rejected the matching funds in the primary. So he rejected matching funds, outspent McCain tremendously in South Carolina. McCain, the great reformer, took the matching funds, agreed to the spending limits state by state, and Bush buried him. So it all depends on whose ox is being gored here. Let's be fair. And
I do. I just say don't tell me you're a reformer when you're the guy. But the other thing I would add on this is there is a case called Buckley versus Vallejo that basically said you can put these limitations on expenditures, but you can't limit what an individual can spend on their own campaign.
yeah, that's a separate issue.
And
A
so
rich guy spending his own money.
Rich guys spending their own money, you can't stop that under the free speech doctrine. And so you can have all this other, but then you advantage the rich people.
But also, if you try and have federal funds in an election, it has to be with accompanying spending limits. If you accept federal funds, you have to agree to abide by aggregate spending, total spending limits, either in the primary state by state or in the general election for the entire general election period. It has to be voluntary. And Barack Obama looked around and said, well, I've got all these smart guys who are going to use the internet to help me raise a lot of money, plus I have some wealthy individuals, and I'm going to raise every penny I can get my hands on. So he rejected federal funding for the general election, rejected limits, and oh ho ho, who was his opponent? Once again, John McCain, who accepted the federal limits spending for the general election, and Obama buried him. He might have beaten him anyway, but this came back to, bite McCain in the posterior twice.
Both McCain and Feingold lost because they were true to their principles, and the other side wasn't, basically. Feingold lost.
But remember our courts, under our system of government, our courts have the last word. And our courts have taken the position that this stuff has to be voluntary and that candidates can opt out. And Obama opted out, and George W. Bush opted out.
One of the things that I know they do in Britain, and given the internet and everything, it may
Right.
not be a feasible thing here, but they require public broadcasting to give
You could do
airtime
that.
to,
You could do that.
Let me tell you about that.
to kind of reduce the cost.
The broadcasters hate that in the United States, and let me tell you why they hate it. We have something called the lowest unit rate. The broadcasters, if I'm running for Congress, broadcasters have to sell my campaign TV ads at the lowest unit rate. That's the lowest rate they charge to the largest volume advertiser they have. So I get to buy my ads at a fairly low rate. However, they're not required to apply the lowest unit rate to these outside groups. These outside groups that have all this money, they come in and they're charged 2 or 3 times the rate that the candidate is charged. They have a lot of money. They want to attack candidates. They don't care that they pay higher rates, and the broadcasters love it. They love the fact that they can get away with charging very high rates for these outside groups. They're not going to give this up. They're not going to support legislation that would require them to charge the outside groups the lowest unit rate the way they do candidates.
Yeah, I certainly understand the political dynamics of that. It's partly because these are public airwaves and their licenses are given to these companies.
And don't think that if you're a local...
There ought to be some obligation.
That if your local television station in your congressional district decides to go after you because you support requiring them to charge lower rates to these outside groups, members of Congress will fold like an accordion. I'm sorry.
Well, that's how McCain-Feingold passed. If you're in a metropolitan area like New York or Los Angeles or even Washington, the papers were really all for McCain. They were for McCain Fund. Of course, it didn't apply to them, but it applied.
Unless they owned a TV station.
Yeah, but it applied to them, and they were all. It was like a conspiracy, and I was the only guy from the D.C. area in the metropolitan area to vote against McCain-Feingold, because they'd run the editorials and they'd say nice things about everything else, and they'd say Davis is a bum and he's not a reformer, and so members got nervous. I mean, they signed onto the bill. They just got nervous.
And I, as chairman of the campaign committee, pled with members of my own caucus, think about what's going to happen under this legislation. And the reaction was, don't tell me about the details. I want to be for reform. They refused to listen. The only people who listened, it's very interesting, in my caucus, we had 3 or 4 members who were also ward leaders. Lipinski in Illinois was a ward leader in Chicago. We had a guy in New York who was a ward leader. We also had one in Philadelphia who was a ward leader.
You had Al Wynn, who was almost similar.
No, but these guys actually were elected
right.
ward leaders in their big cities, and they understood what this legislation was going to do, which was going to take money away from the party organizations. They tried to explain it to their colleagues, and their colleagues would not listen, would not hear the suggestion that there might be a flaw to this legislation.
I want to say thank you for your time. You're working for this, because it's something that's frustrated, I know, a great deal of us. And I worked in D.C. for 8 years and saw the gridlock and such, and see it only getting worse.
But it's worse now.
Yes, it is. My question is in regard to the general public kind of understanding it, because you're talking, very detailed, very fine, related to issues, and I'm following along because of my time there in time working in public affairs. But how are you going to educate the public that this is actually hurting them long term? As far as what are you doing to educate the general public? And then secondarily, how are you educating some of these 527s and some of these major donors, that
C4s.
in regard to this issue too? Because they're seeing the outcome too of just this partisan gridlock. They're not getting their legislation passed, or maybe ultimately that's
Tom, you want to
goals.
start, and then I'll go.
So I'm kind of curious, the general public, and then the 527s, the big spenders, and how
C4s now.
C4s. excuse me.
C4s, yeah.
I don't know where to start on that. I think a lot of people who give out don't care. They're more interested in stopping stuff sometimes and making it happen. Where you get the people who want to make it happen, I get this stuff on my mobile device. I'm just getting bombarded with, emergency or a news bulletin or something like that. You're going to pass a constitutional amendment to do this or that. And it's all garbage. It's just set there to help you raise money. The VOK, the great political scientist, used to say, the public isn't stupid. He said, they're just not that well informed, but they know when the shoe is pinching, and then they'll trade it in for a new pair of shoes. And I think what voters do is we don't expect them to be policy wonks. They just know when something's wrong. They know when body bags are coming home and they don't see any results. They know when there's scandal. They know when they're out of a job. They know when their taxes go up, and they'll vote accordingly on the big issues on how it affects them. On all this other stuff, if the members don't understand it, and their job is to, how do you expect the public to understand it? I don't think they do. So we try to put it out in talking points. But what you'll find is your media models that are just hammering on talking points. Your talking heads, they get the talking points from the party and they talk across each other. That's how they just kind of drive their message. We used to have on our side, and the Democrats had the same, we called it the theme team, and you just try to drive your point each week and just repetition to try to penetrate it. But this stuff is so complicated, if the members don't understand it, how do you expect the public to understand it?
But a lot of the outside money, people who give to these outside groups, as Tom suggested, their objective is to stop something from happening. They're not trying necessarily to pass legislation. They want to stop additional environmental legislation, or they want to stop changes in the tax code that may affect them adversely. So you're not going to go to the C4s and say, gee, fellas, this is a terrible idea, you're giving all this money. Their attitude is, well, we want to buy in, we want to have an influence here. So they're not going to voluntarily give this up. Our country tends to respond to a crisis. And I don't know if we're going to get to the point where we're going to have a crisis in our government anytime soon. We came close a couple of times. When Congress...
TARP was a crisis.
Well, that was in the early part of the Obama administration, but also in terms of the extending the debt ceiling. threatening the full faith and credit of the United States. If Congress were to actually do something like that and not extend the debt ceiling, and if we were to have a financial crisis in this country as a result, you'd have people crying for a lot of change very quickly. This is an interesting thing. We are of the democracies currently on the face of the earth, not ones from olden times, but current democracies. We're the oldest continuous democracy. We're older than Great Britain in terms of a democratic system. And our system, while it's imperfect, tends to, somehow we've managed to ultimately do the right thing most of the time. We don't always do the right thing. So Tom and I are optimists. We believe that our system eventually will right itself in some way, but it's damn hard to get it done. And so there are other people. We're not the only ones who are speaking out on this subject, and we're doing a book tour. And by the way, I don't know if the books are going to actually be here for us to sign. Excuse what, Ken?
Any moment.
Yeah, if any
Keep the questions, right?
If any of you leave before the books get here, you can get one on Amazon. And let me put it that way. But if you want a signed book, please stay for a little bit, and we'll be happy to sign the books. But we're doing presidential libraries around the country. We did the Reagan Library a couple of days ago. We're doing the Nixon Library tonight. We're doing the Clinton Library in Arkansas. We're doing the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas.
Well, we did Meet the
SMU.
Press. We were Fox Power Players of the Week,
Yeah.
so we're getting there.
Yeah, we're on a lot of television shows, NPR, PBS, and we're doing the LBJ School at Austin. So this is interesting for us. Tom and I have never, jointly or individually, have never written a book. Right? I don't know. Those of you who are in academia, this is old hat. But for everybody else, writing a book is hard. It takes a lot of time.
We're ready to apply for tenure.
And it takes a lot of time and a lot of thought. And I don't believe I couldn't have written a book on my own. But working with Tom, we were able to produce a book. What we did an outline of 16 chapters. We divided it up. Tom wrote 8, most of 8. I wrote most of 8. And then we commented on each other's chapters. So when you get the book, you'll see at the beginning of each chapter, it'll say who wrote the chapter. And then at the end, there'll be a comment by the other person, sometimes long, sometimes short. We jointly wrote the chapter at the end about our recommendations for the future. But this was a very interesting exercise. The way we got put together is that Chuck Todd, before he did Meet the Press, used to do a show every morning. Now it was at 9 o'clock in Eastern. I don't know what time you got it out here, but it was on MSNBC, the Daily Rundown. And Chuck knew both of us, and he paired us, put us together on TV, to a Democrat and a Republican, to do commentary about what was going on in Washington. And then we've done a lot of that since then. We appear on Bloomberg, we appeared on CNN, occasionally on Fox, and we also speak to a lot of trade associations and corporations, various groups who want to learn about what's happening in Congress. So Tom and I have been doing this together for some time, but as he mentioned in the beginning, that we realized after talking to each other that we viewed things pretty much the same way. You know, in terms of what the problem was, we didn't agree on individual issues necessarily, but this is not meant to be a partisan book. It's not an anti-Republican book or an anti-Democratic book. We're not into tearing anybody down. We're just trying to analyze what's happened in the last 20 or 25 years and then pick some solutions for the future, and we hope some people will listen to us. We hope that Congress will listen to us. I've been out of Congress since the end of 2004. Tom's been out you left at 2008. We both had our own parties move away from us. One of the reasons that we're not still in Congress. Tom wanted to run for the United States Senate in Virginia. He's a moderate Republican. The state of Virginia, the Republican Party was controlled by the hard right. In Virginia, they have an option of having a primary or a convention. They were worried that Tom would win a primary statewide, so they went to a convention system that the bad old boys controlled, and so that he couldn't be nominated.
I actually think I could have won, but what the heck? I'm in a better place.
Let's just say Tom is doing very well now.
Exactly.
At one time, I was a moderate Democrat from a southern state. I would have had a chance to continue to move up in the leadership, but it was clear that my party, the Democratic Caucus, had moved away from me, and that I was not, while I was caucus chair, I was not going to be able to hold a greater leadership position on the Democratic side. So we're both doing something else. It was a hell of a run. We had a great time in Congress. We accomplished a lot. We enjoyed it. I think we were good members, but the system has changed, and there is less room for people like us today in either party, as you saw from things that Tom put up on the screen.
Yeah, so given the present set of circumstances, if you're a bipartisan member in Congress, for example, I worked for Senator Warner this summer in Virginia, who has been rated as one of the most bipartisan members of the Senate.
Right.
And if you're someone like that, how do you run on that record of accomplishment when you can't coordinate with these outside bodies, and your opponent can't coordinate these outside bodies?
I'm not from Virginia, though I live in Virginia now and I vote in Virginia. I'll give you a short answer. Tom can give you a longer answer because he's spent his political life in Virginia. I was a good supporter of Mark Warner's. We both live in Old Town, Virginia. We live very close to each other, Old Town, Alexandria. I think he's a great United States Senator. Mark Warner thought that all he had to do was talk about his record of bipartisanship and his reasonableness, and he'd be reelected. But that's not necessarily what people were buying. They weren't buying what he was selling in that election, and he almost lost because of that. Tom?
He almost lost because the turnout among the Democratic base was down because he didn't throw him any red meat. I know Mark very well. My wife was in the state Senate when he was governor, and we've had a long relationship. But the problem is, in the election, they talked about how he was 98% of the time voting with Obama. The reason is Harry Reid wouldn't let anything come to the floor except these nominations, and you're going to vote for your person's nomination. So, although, yeah, I think he's genuinely bipartisan. I think he's genuinely much more centered. The voting record didn't express that just because of what Reid allowed to come up, and he just got nailed on this issue.
Also, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I vote now in Virginia. So I walked into my polling place, my wife and I walked in on election day in Old Town Alexandria, a strongly Democratic precinct. I walked in, got my ballot, and walked out. There was no line. And I started calling some of my friends, and I say, hey, we got a problem here. Turnout on our side is down. And for a variety of reasons, the Democratic turnout was down in Virginia, and Mark almost lost because of that. He thought he could go back into those rural areas and be the reasonable man. And the people in the rural areas didn't want to hear the reasonable man.
But he couldn't get the blacks and the students and the Democratic base voters out for him either. I spoke at the Alexandria Democratic Committee there. They invited me to speak because they were roasting Jim Moran, who was retiring, and Jim was a friend of mine. They wanted a Republican to speak. And I had him rolling the aisles, and a couple of other guys got up and just throwing the red meat and had him on their feet. Mark Warner, he put him to sleep. And he'd bring John Warner with him, which is great for the handful of swing voters that are left.
Former Republican senator.
Yeah, he brought the former Republican senator who had endorsed him, and he had a good Republicans for list. But this is all about getting your base votes out, and he didn't do that. And the turnout in Virginia was less than the governor's race, which is an off year.
It's an odd numbered year.
And it was 150,000 votes less than in 2006 midterm election. So that was a huge problem for him.
But he really convinced himself that he could be the reasonable man, and that would elect
Well, I spent
him.
a half hour with him after the election explaining. I think he gets it, but he wants to be a good senator, and he's worth a couple $100 million. So if things don't work out there, he's got other options. He's a good man. I think.
Yeah, somebody.
Hi, I was wondering how much you think the impact of the decline in the number of split ticket voters, like the ones who aren't more of an in this election cycle, how much that's affected the partisan gridlock.
A lot. Look, when I would buck my party on a vote, and look, I had a district. My presidential candidate never carried my district, so I always ran way ahead of the ticket. In 2006, George Allen got 42% in his Senate reelect in my district. I was down to 56%, which was my lowest reelect ever. But the new people moving in, I didn't have time to introduce myself to them. People have been there a long time, knew me as county executive and everything else. But it became tougher and tougher, and I was getting no points when I bucked the party on something. The safe place for people to be is stay in your box. Even in the swing districts, it's stay in your box, get your vote out. there just aren't that many swing voters. Now, the irony is, nationally, we've seen more people register as independents. There is a group that behave independently. The last 3 times you've had one party control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. In the next midterm, that party gets swept out. I always said in 1994, my voters in Fairfax County elected me to Congress over a Democratic incumbent to protect them from Bill Clinton. And 2 years later, they re-elected Clinton to protect him from me. That in point of fact, you do have a group of the electorate that's not happy with either party. It's a small group, but this is a pretty polarized country. Do you know how many states were within 5 points in the presidential race? 4. Only 4 states were within 5 points. We've moved apart like that, so the tendency, go to my base, get my base out.
Yeah, but it is interesting because when I was first elected from Texas in 1978, we did have a lot of split ticket voters. The state was becoming more and more conservative, but we had a lot of folks who would vote for a Republican for president and then vote for a Democrat for Congress. It doesn't happen very much anymore.
But it's not by happenstance. Karl Rove and the Bush side, Obama's, they doubled down. These folks just doubled down on their base. They could have governed from the center. They chose not to. Clinton governed more from the center. You could vote to impeach him one day and he'd sign your bill the next. He was able to. He looks better in retrospect, you know. But Bush and Obama have doubled down on their bases and just have been singularly unwilling to come to the middle and leave their comfort zones.
What you had happen in 1996, which is I was chairman of the campaign committee that year. It wasn't that long ago. For their own individual reasons, Clinton and Gingrich, who was the speaker, decided that they needed to work together on some pieces of legislation to show that they were effective. And so they worked together on raising the minimum wage and on reforming welfare.
It's called triangulation.
Well, but what it was that both sides recognized that there was benefit in working together. So Clinton was reelected and the Republicans retained control of the House. And Gingrich continued on as speaker. You wouldn't have that today. You wouldn't have a president who of one party and a speaker of another party who would decide, well, gee, you know, this is a good deal. We can go to the people and say we actually accomplished X, Y, and Z. That's not the way the system works right now. I would hope we would go back to that at some point.
One of the things that, there's 2 points that I think you made that I think are worth highlighting and just listening to the whole thing. One is the fact that we have a separation of powers system, not a parliamentary system,
Right.
and that in a separation of powers system, the only way you actually can pass legislation is through compromise. And when you set up institutions and mechanisms not to allow or make it difficult for compromise, it's hard to do anything. So that's kind of peculiar to our political system. Maybe in an era where not much needs to happen, that's okay, but when you're facing a lot of world challenges and economic challenges, it's a worry. And then the other is this question of the population, and I don't know if you have this in the book or not, but it does appear that the American electorate is also becoming more polarized. It's not just the politicians that are more polarized. Even in California, you know, you have California is kind of like a mini United States in that sense. And right along the coast where the cities are, it's very democratic, but you go in, you know, 50 miles, 75 miles from the coast, it's all Republican. And so it's the rural areas are that, you know, there's a huge divide. And it's very hard to make districts actually that even with an independent commission that balance this just because of the
Well, you can't. You're going to have residential sorting. But as I said, only 4 states were within 5 points of each other in the presidential race. These other races, they just moved apart. And people who think alike live alike. There's a book, The Big Sort, that talks about this phenomenon. It's been growing. The other thing is we note in the book, we got some really interesting stuff. New Hampshire, 62% of the voters in New Hampshire weren't born in New Hampshire. The transiency of the population today has changed this so that it used to be you could be all politics is local, you grew up there, it mattered. Doesn't matter anymore. People are moving in and out, and so that they can hang on to the party label. That's a good identification. It's just hard for members to personalize this stuff.
I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you a California example. When I was chairman of the campaign committee, we had a district up in the northern part of the state, north of of San Francisco all the way up to the Oregon line that had gone back and forth between Democrats and Republicans every couple of years. And so I got a call one day from Vice President Gore. And he said, Martin, there's a candidate that I would like you to support in that district. I think it was the first district. I'm not sure if I have my numbers
it was.
right.
It was Doug Bosco's.
Yeah,
school district.
but he said, I've got to, either there was a Republican incumbent or the Republican was not running. It was going to be an open seat. And he said, I've got a candidate I'd like you and the campaign committee to support. And I said, well, who is that, Mr. Vice President? And he said, well, Michaela Alioto. Now, she was the granddaughter of Mayor Alioto of San Francisco. And Mayor Alioto had been a big supporter of Vice President Gore's. And so he said, well, I'd like you to support Mayor Alioto's granddaughter. And I said, Mr. Vice President, she's too liberal for that district. She can't win. So I had to tell the Vice President of the United States that we could not field a liberal in that district and expect to win it. Now, as it turned out, and I and others suggested that maybe Michaela should run for the General Assembly rather than for Congress. She ultimately did that, and we found Mike Thompson, who was a Vietnam War veteran and who fit that district like a glove. He won it, and he's still there. But it's hard to do that.
But that district was described this way. Doug Bosco held the thing. He said, everybody in my districts likes trees. He said, half of them like them horizontal, half of them vertical.
But the party has to be willing and able to find candidates in the middle if the district is that inclination. The Republicans made a mistake in the Senate races for a couple of times where they nominated absolutely crazy people through the through the primary process and lost states that they should have won because they couldn't get a decent person out of the primary. So it's hard sometimes given the way the politics work.
But that's only in purple states. In red states,
yeah, red states we couldn't win.
It doesn't matter. In the purple states, to win, even in a good year like 2010,
yeah.
I said, we lost the governorship in Virginia. My comment was, all we needed was a mammal, and we could have won this thing. But candidates still matter in purple states. But in red and blue states, it doesn't matter.
But the Republicans nominated a nut to run against Claire McCaskill in Maryland, in Missouri, a swing state. Claire won. They nominated a nut to run in Indiana. After that, the person defeated an incumbent moderate Republican senator, and they lost that state. They put a nutcase up against Harry Reid in Nevada, a state that they should have had a real shot at winning. So primaries make a difference.
I wouldn't describe them, but they didn't fit they didn't fit the state.
Anyway.
They would have won in red states, though.
We got one final question here. There we go.
So you both talked about how the media and the internet are kind of talking past each other and the negative consequences of that. And I'm just curious how you see the internet and the role of the media kind of improving participation and the role of civic engagement and how that's going.
Well, they clearly improve participation. On the fundraising side, we're just seeing the fruits of fundraising on the internet, which is you're getting more mass contributions on that. The democratization now of campaign financing into some of these. Unfortunately, it's very ideological appeals that are working. These aren't centrist appeals. People don't give, unless you arouse them in some kind of way. So we're just beginning. I think we're still on the edge of seeing how this all develops. We both don't think we ought to get government interference into this kind of stuff, that it'll find its way out. But until that happens, you can have a guy write a $100 million check if they want to do that, and that'll unbalance a lot of these small contributions, and that's still very, very legal. I think that's a bigger danger. The democratization of giving is probably a good thing overall. I don't think it centers things, though, because people generally don't give to centrists. They give to causes left and right.
But also, I mean, politicians have to come to grips with current reality here. I teach a class on parties and elections at George Washington University in the Graduate School of Management. So the first day I asked, and some of these are young people right out of undergraduate school, others have been out for a while, worked in government. And so I asked the first day, how many of you read newspapers? None of them read newspapers. None of them read the Washington Post and the New York Times as newspapers. They get all their news online. And politicians haven't quite mastered this. Some have better than others. It's a different world now, and we have to learn how to communicate with young people. And some older people too who are doing the same thing these days.
Very good. Well, didn't. We delivered on our promise. A very engaging discussion and presentation. So please join me in thanking you.